she fundamentally dives into service and change and advocacy using engagement. She doesn't have that quiet conversation from outside. Instead, she just dives into the work. So she's involved in numerous boards and leadership positions and has a deep interest in advocacy through intersectional frameworks. And that's pretty powerful. So with that, I'm going to introduce Katie and presenting on equal in politics in the region.
I'm not a wanderer, so sorry about that. I'm right here. You can't see me, it's because I didn't bring my stool with me. So bear with me. Good evening, everyone. My heart is full being in this room with you tonight to celebrate International Women's Day and to have all of these good vibes. It's always really awesome to be able to participate with other movers and shakers in our North Dakota communities who are interested in pursuing equity in whatever form that it may be. And so I'm really glad that you all came out here tonight. I think that it always means something. When you get out of your house, when it's cold and windy and gross, and you make the effort to be together with other people. So thank you for coming tonight. I'm really excited to share with you all. International Women's Day is a global day celebrating the social and economic process that was made toward human rights and gender equality. It's also an opportunity to reflect on the ways we can mold a more equitable future. 2020's International Women's Day theme is Each for Equal, as that nice video that we saw earlier. It's a theme that asks people to think more broadly about how we all may work together to achieve more balance by challenging stereotypes and broadening perceptions through collaboration. Collaboration, that's kind of the kicker, the key word. Everyone loves that word these days. And yet it's actually really difficult to put into motion, isn't it? Whether it's just two people working on a group project in college to a nation trying to legislate policies for its citizens. Collaboration seems to be the Achilles heel of community, despite the positives that it provides when it is actually accomplished for all of us. I was asked to speak about what Each for Equal means to me, and while I do understand that we are here celebrating women today, the concept that kept returning to me when I was preparing for this talk was intersectionality. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, intersectionality was a term that was coined by human rights activist and law professor and all-around badass. I'm really glad this is like a theme also. Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap and affect the way that we experience our lives and our journey. For example, I am a woman, and I don't know if you noticed, but I'm also a woman of color. I am not white. While I experience sexism as a woman and may empathize with other women of all races, white women are not going to experience the racism that I, as a woman of color, will experience at the same time as I experience sexism. It does not mean that they don't experience discrimination, or in this case, sexism. It just means that my intersecting identities create a different realm of experience as both sexism and racism intersect for me based on the very nature of who I am. The same could be said for a non-cisgender woman. While I am a woman, I am cisgender, and thus would not experience sexism in the same manner as she. It is then my responsibility to listen to her and come alongside her, not to tell her that she's making me feel uncomfortable. That's not intersectional allyship. In fact, it's not even listening. Arguably, it's purposely disempowering her, silencing the person that I would purport to ally with by only hearing what I view as important and discarding the other messier intersectional bits that I haven't experienced or don't understand myself. And if we are truly to aim for equity for humanity, we need to show up for each other and hold space for each other to be the authentically multifaceted beings that we are. There are many more examples in which intersectional framework may be applied by its very nature more rather than less. And all the varying combinations produce distinct effects for those who would live those experiences. Experiences that may be very different than our own, despite being so similar. This is why it's so important for feminists and womanists to understand intersectionality in regards to allyship, so that it may inform our words and our actions, so that the impact of our allyship does not, in fact, further marginalize the people that we love. So how does this affect people's lives? comes in many layers and protects us in ways that blind us despite what marginalization we may have experienced or continue to experience. Ultimately, these blinders to privilege are what continue to divide people and cause at best apathy, or at worst, denial that oppression even exists. If we truly desire to live in a community that socially and systemically affords people the right to live and prosper, we cannot afford to not fully listen. Tone policing that demands marginalized folks be more cognizant to the feelings of their oppressors cannot continue. Holding up our goodness in the articles that we shared on social media or liked on Facebook cannot continue. Tokenizing our family and friends that may identify with a marginalized group and using their body as verification, and yet discarding their voices because they don't fit our worldview, cannot continue. Moving forward, a full recognition of intersectional identities and how they make individuals who they are can no longer be dismissed as too hard. We cannot silo a person's identities from their full self without dehumanizing them in the process. If we truly want to see the holistic change of our communities for the betterment of all its people, we cannot sit idly by and wonder at all the bad stuff that's happening out there. No, we need to engage, and we need to open our eyes to see and open our ears to hear the very real lived experiences of our neighbors. We must take up the burden of our privilege and be actionable allies to those who are crushed by the weight of intersectional and systemic injustices. So what is an ally? I'm sure some of you already have a working idea of what this is, but for those of you who don't, the noun definition of an ally is one that is associated with another as a helper. The actionable definition or verb form of an ally is one who unites or forms a connection between, to enter into an alliance, a bond or connection formed to further the common interests of its members. All that to say that an ally is someone who has a personal commitment to fighting oppression and injustice, and does not just think it, but goes out into the world to actually do the work. You cannot embrace parts of us and then claim to be an ally. We are not tokens to be used as payment for your guilt. So why are intersectional allies important in the pursuit of equal for all? An intersectional ally is someone who may or may not identify with a marginalized group, but understands the gravity of an action for fellow humans. Intersectionality is a relatively newly coined term. I did say in the 80s. And yet, it is an experience people have endured throughout the ages. It is not a new phenomenon itself. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote from a Birmingham jail cell, "Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. Community is a beautiful, messy, and complicated beast in which our diversity divides and strengthens us. The key is to make sure that we are making space for all of it and for everyone, so that instead of inviting people to our table, we're actually building it together. Because when people feel empowered to engage in their community, to vocalize their experiences and their wants, their hopes, even their fears, definitely to voice their fears. If we are able to hold space for people that have been continually told to stay silent for the good of the order, so that they may express their full thoughts, both the good and the bad, we inch closer to equality, true equality. And when people are able to be seen for who they are, when their voices are heard above any kind of splaining, and taken at face value, this is where we as a people will begin to understand what quality of life is, what it has always meant in the context of community, in the context of human dignity, and what equal for all really means. And this won't happen overnight, but it can happen. It is possible, and simply pursuing it in good faith together is what it means to be North Dakota legendary. Woo-hoo. Woo! So how can we be intersectional allies? It's so easy to jump in gung-ho and want to save the world. I am guilty as charged as well. To ride the wave of feel-good messages and pats on the back from others and privilege who admire us for being bold. It is much more difficult to listen to the truths that are spoken to us our privileges, complicity, and others' marginalization. We cannot allow our defensiveness, our want to be seen as good, to hold us back from hearing and holding space for those who are hurting. It is not about our comfort. If it is, we are not listening to empower and lift up one another, but rather we're listening to ensure that we're keeping up appearances and keeping people in their place. It was Representative Ruth Buffalo who observed that the boat you are so used to rocking is in fact sinking. One of the most unsafe places for marginalized folks is well-meaning woke allies who get it, but that have stopped doing the actual work on themselves. They rest on what they think they know while ignoring or tokenizing the voices that are speaking to them. Don't be one of those people. You will mess up. You will make mistakes. We all do. We're all human. But if we're going to change as a society for the better, it will be because we recognize the importance of allowing each other to be fully seen and fully heard. But this can only happen if we are willing to first listen, and then second, listen to act. But before I leave you, I want to share with you an excerpt from feminist and human rights activist Audre Lorde's 1982 address, Learning from the 60s. In order to work together, we do not have to become a mix of indistinguishable particles resembling a vat of homogeneized chocolate milk. Unity implies the coming together of elements which are, to begin with, varied and diverse in their particular natures. Our persistence in examining the tensions within diversity encourages growth toward our common goal. So often we either ignore the past or romanticize it, render the reason for unity useless or mythic. We forget that the necessary ingredient needed to make the past work for the future is our energy in the present, metabolizing one into the other. Continuity does not happen automatically, nor is it a passive process. Revolution is not a one-time event. It is becoming always vigilant for the smallest opportunity to make a genuine change in established, outgrown responses. For instance, it is learning to address each other's difference with respect. You do not have to be me in order for us to fight alongside with each other. I do not have to be you to recognize that our wars are the same. What we must do is commit ourselves to some future that can include each other and to work toward that future with the particular strength of our individual identities. And in order to do this, we must allow each other our differences at the same time as we recognize our sameness. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So, to those women who have been marching, organizing, raising children to be both respectful and respectable, standing tall while being belittled, to the women whose battle cries have long since turned into hymns of sorrow and funeral dirges, for the hope that you thought you would see realized in your lifetime is dwindling, to the women whose bones are weary from the burden of inequality, injustice, and indiscriminate sexism, to the young girls who are watching their mothers, sisters, aunties, and grandmothers show up day after day so that they may have opportunities those before them only dreamed of having. Let me encourage you with this, because I don't want to leave you sad. There is a metaphor you are given about any women's movement. They call you thunder. You shake the ground. But let me be perfectly clear. You are not just the noise. Thunder, while earth-shaking, sometimes fear-inducing, still rolls away eventually. You are not the thunder that shakes the pillars of a broken system. You are the lightning that will burn it to the ground. And the good news is that beautiful things can come out of ashes. And now once more, onto the breach, dear friends.
We're up to the point of having our keynote address tonight, and I'm absolutely beside myself in introducing our speaker. I had to be really diligent about my notes because I remember when I heard that she was speaking, I was letting my partner know, you're going to get a chance work and her hard work and advocacy. I remember crying. I remember just feeling like I wanted to leave and change the world and to conquer it. And that's really powerful to have somebody share their experiences and all the work that they're doing and take you through all of that. She is a civil rights attorney, an activist, a former law professor, the executive director of Wayfinder Foundation. She supports women of color, activists and organizers. She started and directed Community Justice Project, which is an award-winning civil rights legal clinic. She's the owner of Black Pearl LLC. She's a TED Talk speaker, has advised the Black Lives Matter movement, and was the president of the Minneapolis NAACP. And that is just a snippet of the list of amazing things about her. I've heard her story of activism and hard work, and you will find that she is moving, motivating, and incredible. And I'm honored to present Dakota Levy.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a privilege and an honor to be in North Dakota with you all again. Here from the Twin Cities. I'm thankful to Narmal for, did I say your name right?
Yes, you did.
You didn't tell me if I didn't, so. My name is mispronounced all the time, so I just want to make sure
Don't worry about it.
that I have the name correct. But I'm just grateful to you for your vision and all of the amazing women that you have assembled to be a part of this incredible program. So give yourselves for the beautiful diversity in this room. I mean, I step into many rooms all the time, and they don't always look like this, right? Just the beauty that I see, the different cultural backgrounds, the different life experiences being represented. And I think that that's the heart of what International Women's Day is all about. Now, to be honest with you all, as an African American woman, I sometimes forget that March is Women's History Month. Because so often, when you are a person of color or an indigenous woman within our society, our racial and ethnic background, our nationality tends to come first because of all of the oppression that we experience as a result of the color of our skin. And when we think about what typically happens in the feminism movement and when we're talking about women's rights, our rights as women of color and indigenous women are often on the periphery. So we may not even see space for the issues that we experience and the impacts that are happening in our community. And so many of us celebrate our heritage before we celebrate our gender, right? And how can that be? Why should we have to choose one over the other? I'm fully African American and I'm fully woman at the same time. My children remind me of that, right? And so it's something to think about for those who are focused on women's rights, to remember that we are not just an asterisk in the story that's being told about women's history. Our experiences matter. We have helped to shape and build this country and these institutions even when we are not represented within them. So any of us who travel to Washington, D.C., we look at the beautiful buildings, but most of us have no idea that those buildings were built by enslaved men, women, and children, right? And that's the history throughout many parts of this country. When we look at the wealth that has been accumulated, that it has been accumulated on the backs of Black, brown, and indigenous people, right? And even our Asian brothers and sisters who are often left out of the story. They have experienced oppression as well on many, many levels, but they're often not even included in the whole black-white paradigm in the way that we talk about race in this nation. And part of why we're still so locked into this black-white paradigm when we're talking about race is because we still have so many unreconciled racial issues, right? Why is it that when we are talking about women, most of us know we're just really talking about white women? Right? How often do you see job postings listed where they say, we are looking for people of color and women? And it's like, what? where do we just say white women? If that's who you are really talking about, right? So you guys will see that as I'm unpacking this information, and I'm just straightforward. I'm not Minnesota nice, even though I've lived in Minnesota for about 17 years. I was born in the deep south in Jackson, Mississippi, but I moved to South Central Los Angeles when I was 8 years old. And so in LA, people are just very straightforward, they're very blunt, they say what they mean, and that can be very difficult in environments where people are hesitant, to speak their truth, right? So you guys can imagine what happens in the Twin Cities when I show up and when other outspoken people show up, and we speak our truths unapologetically. But I would argue that in 2020, that's what we need to do as women from all backgrounds. We need to show up boldly and unapologetically, and we need to show up with open hearts and open minds, and to understand that our stories matter, but our stories only tell a part of the story. We have to begin to understand what other people in our community have been experiencing, and the fact that their voices are often not heard. And even as we fight to make our own voices heard, we have to hold the door open for somebody else to be able to speak their truth. Right? That's what it comes down to. And we know that as we are showing up and we are speaking our truth and we're being bold and we're being outspoken, that we're going to step on some toes. We're going to ruffle some feathers. We're going to have some people who feel uncomfortable. And as Katie was talking about, sometimes some of those people are so-called allies, right, who can only go so far with you in the movement due to maybe their own discomfort or their own fear. But I always urge allies to step way outside of their comfort zone and to choose love rather than white supremacy. That's really what it comes down to. So if you go back and you look at Dr. King's 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, now the content of his letter was, just in a controversial, televised conversation between Nina Turner, who's a surrogate for Bernie Sanders, and a white woman who is a surrogate, I can't remember her name, but she's a surrogate for Joe Biden. And basically the white woman was trying to tell Nina Turner what Dr. King really meant when he was talking about black moderates. And, first of all, that is offensive, right, for a white woman to try to tell a black woman what Dr. King meant when we live his words every day. We feel the impacts of his words every day. And we look from one generation to the next, and we see the outcomes in terms of what those devastating racist policies and laws and practices have done on our community. And we realize that when we look at the outcomes and the disparities that are impacting our communities, that so often, even by allies, we're blamed for the plight of what happens in our communities. Even though, again, we don't run these institutions, we don't create these laws, we don't control the wealth in this country, yet we are seen as responsible for the oppression that we experience. But if you look back at Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, if you just change the date and a little bit of the terminology that he used, so, he talked about Negroes, so nowadays we don't call ourselves Negroes, we call ourselves African Americans, black people, people of color. And if you look at his letter, he talks about white moderates and how he felt that white moderates were actually the folks who were preventing us from progressing as African Americans. And he said this because he said, most of the time white moderates are saying that they're with us, but when we start protesting and when we start demonstrating and when we start showing up and making other white people feel uncomfortable, we're told that you need to sit back and you need to wait. And he's, making this argument that, waiting has never resulted in any kind of change for anyone. Waiting just merely is saying, hey, the passage of time is going to solve all of these issues. And he's like, that is absolutely not true. Like, time is neutral. Time itself is not going to change anything. You have to be a catalyst for change if you want to change something. And he's saying to white moderates, like, look, you guys are telling us we need to wait. And then you're pointing at the Ku Klux Klanners and the white citizens counselors, but I'm looking at you, right? Because so often in our society, we look at the most obvious individuals who represent white supremacy, but many of us feel more safe because at least we can see our enemy, right? We can see what they're about. We know what they stand for. So we can be on guard. But it's when you allow people to get close to you who are saying that they're with you, and then they start sending you signals that you need to slow down, you need to stop what you're doing, you're being disruptive, that those individuals can be far more dangerous. So I do a lot of my work in the Twin Cities right alongside white allies who are saying that they want to be advocates for racial justice. And what I always say to them is, don't just say it, it's what you do that actually counts. Right? So we can sit in a room like this and we can talk about, for International Women's Day, you know, how we can hold hands, we can be supportive of one another, but it's what happens outside the walls of this room that really matters in terms of how you show up for other women. Right? And it's important to understand the level of privilege that many white people hold in our society. Privilege is something that you inherited. So it's not something to be ashamed of. It's something to understand that this exists with or without your consent, and you, once you're conscious of it, you make an active decision whether or not you use your privilege for good or for evil, because that privilege is going to be there no matter what. And so I talk to white women in particular all the time about how are they using their voices. Like when a racial incident happens in the Twin Cities, we may have, you know, white friends, white women who are like, well, I don't know what to do. This makes me sad. I want to do something. I'm like, well, what would you do if this was your child? You would show up. You would write a letter, and I know y'all know how to write letters, right? And when it's something that's important to you. So don't clam up now that it's a racial issue. Use those same tools as advocates and get on the front lines. And often you can be more powerful than you even imagine because people are expecting you to engage in white solidarity as opposed to standing on the side of justice with people of color and people from indigenous backgrounds who are experiencing oppression. So just recently, we had, you know, a test come up, if you will, when one of our senators ran for president of the United States, Amy Klobuchar. And if anybody was paying attention, some of you may have voted for Amy, and I say, hey, that was your choice. But I was one of the people, along with a multiracial coalition of individuals, who was raising concerns about Amy's role as a prosecutor in Hennepin County, right? And even though, you know, she should have been an ally to communities of color, instead, unfortunately, she often used her privilege, and it had a devastating impact upon communities of color. So she took a very tough on crime approach, and she even, you know, extended sentence lengths for some petty offenses. She had a zero tolerance policy for juvenile crime, so even when juveniles were engaged in nonviolent low-level offenses, they were going to face significantly more time under her regime as the prosecutor. And all of this stuff is documented. This isn't just stuff that I'm saying. Men who didn't pay their child support, some of them were charged with felonies, right, for those kind of things. So we're talking about some very, very serious issues here. And then there was an issue of a young African-American man who was just a teenager at the time, 16 years old, by the name of Mayan Morrell, who was brought into the justice system for a crime he did not commit, and he was sentenced to life in prison. And the crime that happened was an egregious crime. There was some kind of a drive-by situation, and someone was shooting, and they shot near a home where this little 11-year-old girl by the name of Taisha Edwards was sitting at the table doing her homework. And that bullet went through the wall, it pierced her heart, and she was killed. So you can imagine that Amy Klobuchar, other people in the community are rising up, saying that we're going to go after the people who did this. Well, the problem was our Minneapolis Police Department has a very long history of corruption, and they center in on one of the suspects as this 16-year-old kid who was not there, had nothing to do with the crime, and who has been in prison now for nearly 18 years. And so as the campaign for president was unfolding, we were trying to bring attention to this issue and trying to get Amy's attention to address this, saying, how can you ascend to president of the United States when you have all of these black bodies in your wake that have been impacted by your policies, right? And by how you use your privilege and how you use your platform and how you use solidarity with white people in Hennepin counties to bring all of these black men into the system. And then how can you be president when you have an innocent young man who is still incarcerated and that has not been addressed? And so initially, they thought that, you know, it was gonna be ignored, just like some of the other stories about Amy and her staff. They thought it was just going to be swept under the rug, but a small group of committed people refused to allow that to happen. We took an Associated Press article that was part of a year-long investigation going into the case, and then we called a press conference, we called rallies, and the very last rally that we called was the night before Amy Klobuchar ended her campaign. And we showed up in a room just like this, probably maybe 2 or 3 times the size, with about ultimately like 99% of white folks. And there was people of color and also white allies. And so we joke with our white women friends because they talk about having like a wall of white women allies who were standing there chanting Black Lives Matter and Free Mayan Morrell. And you can imagine how that confused the white people in the room who were thinking, well, who are these white folks standing with these people of color saying that Black Lives Matter, and all we're trying to do is get our candidate elected. And so it was just an interesting dichotomy to witness people in the room who are largely progressive, who don't consider themselves to be racist, who do not consider themselves to be, let's say, Trump supporters, who do not consider themselves to be harmful to communities of color, willing to put our issues and our concerns on the back burner for the sake of what they thought was important. That is the exact opposite of allyship. And some of the conversations that we were having with the individuals in the room who were upset about our protest was to say, well, if you don't want us here, what did you do when you first heard about Mayan Morrell's case, or when you first heard about Amy Klobuchar's record as a prosecutor to hold your candidate accountable for addressing this issue? And of course, they didn't have an answer. Why? Because they thought, oh, yeah, that happened a long time ago when she was a Hennepin County attorney, and now she needs to become our president. Right? That's the trade-off that white people have to be conscious of, that you are constantly being presented with on a regular basis, because when you stand up for racial justice for real, it's going to cost you something. Beyond just a Facebook post and maybe losing some Facebook friends, right? It's going to actually cost you something. It's going to take a sacrifice to stand up in the face of white supremacy, sometimes confronting people who look like you and who believe they're as progressive as you and who believe that they're also allies to our cause, and challenging their mentality, their behavior, and their mindsets. And so many white people, particularly white women, are not prepared for that. Because if you haven't had to live life outside of your comfort zone, it can be very difficult to empathize enough with the plight of people who do not look like you to be willing to make the sacrifices that are required to actually show true solidarity. And so throughout the whole end of that process, you know, we stood there, we chanted, we protested, and we stood our ground. And at the end of the day, rather than come out and face us or meet with us, and one of the demands we made was for Amy to come out and have the family on stage with her and share with the protesters about the case while we were there. Instead of doing that, she chose to actually cancel her own rally. And then, 12 hours later, she suspended her campaign, which was the thing we had called for from the beginning. Deal with this. You are a white woman. You're saying that you're an ally. You're saying people of color support you. Deal with this issue. Don't be willing to ignore even one black body to get the power and the access that you are saying is important to you. Right? And so we're asking those kinds of questions. We're raising those kind of demands of all of our allies who are saying that they're in this fight. How are you willing to prove that? How can you demonstrate that you are serious about what you're saying is important to you? And so what wound up happening, I'll fast forward a little bit, is that 2 days later, after the rally was shut down, we actually met with Amy Klobuchar. So the family of Mayan Morrell, the Minneapolis NAACP president, and myself, and some of Amy's campaign team, we actually had a meeting and we talked about Mayan's case. She got to hear directly from the family, and we made some asks of her, and we reminded her that she could have handled this much sooner if she wouldn't have just had, like this white privilege lens on. And so ultimately, 2 days after that meeting, Amy actually wrote a letter, which is one of the things that was requested of her, requesting an independent investigation into Mayan Burrell's case. And so there are folks now in the community who are believing now in the power of protest, right? In the power of demonstrations, in the power of disruption. Most of us are taught that those things are just inconvenient, that they're annoying, that shouldn't be happening. Like, I empathize with your cause, but you're doing too much. You're trying to shut stuff down. You're trying to disrupt our meetings and our organizations and the way that we do business. And the sad part is that sometimes it comes down to that because of the difficulty of simply having our voices be heard. And so we have so many people now who are believing in this process that sometimes you have to disrupt in order to get justice. And this is not just us as people of color who are saying this. This is the legacy of the women's movement that we're talking about, right? That had to look at the way in which white landholding men, white wealthy men were operating and going in and disrupting business as usual to say, hey, we also deserve the right to vote. Still asking for equal wages, still asking for the right to be respected under the law with regard to our reproductive health and being able to make decisions for our bodies. And we've had to be disruptive, and white women have had to be disruptive to have their voices be heard. So what I ask of white women allies is to think about the struggle that you all go through in being seen as equal as your white male counterparts, and how frustrating it is when you see the lack of responsiveness of those in power and leadership to your plight, when it's right there in black and white, when the statistics reinforce everything that you're saying, when there are anecdotes that prove the harms that are being caused. Apply that same energy and that same frustration and those same leadership skills to what you see happening to your black, brown, and indigenous sisters, right? That's what, I can get an amen on that. International Women's Day. We can't celebrate International Women's Day when there's a racial hierarchy involved, right? And when we haven't done the legwork outside of this space, how do we come together in genuine solidarity if after we leave here, our black, brown, indigenous, our Asian sisters are still going to experience immense oppression? Because when we show up somewhere, we can't always count on white women to stand with us and speak the truth, and being willing to stand against white supremacy. So when white people come into my space, I have my office, as was announced, I have a consulting firm called Black Pearl. I do a lot of workshops through there, and one of my workshops is called 5 Problems Everyone Has with White Allies and How to Solve Them. And so when people come into the space, it's like, I speak the truth. I'm like, listen, we cannot tiptoe around these conversations because it makes people uncomfortable. You have to be willing to get uncomfortable in order to take a deep dive. And even that discomfort that some of you guys are feeling right now, for just a few minutes while I'm up here speaking, and probably a little bit when Katie was speaking, this is the discomfort we face on a regular basis when we're going into white spaces with brown and black and yellow and red skin. Right? It's not right. We're having to be on edge all the time just to simply show up as your full self. But I made a decision a long time ago that I was going to have to get out of my comfort zone. It was not easy. It was not natural just because I'm African American. I had to make choices. I was a law professor for 14 years, 13 of which were at the University of St. Thomas Law School. So even though, my roots were, being born in the Deep South, growing up in South Central LA in a very poor Black and Latinx neighborhood, when I got into that ivory tower, I was protected by privilege on a whole other level, right? The level of access that I had, the level of comfort that I had, big, beautiful building, disconnected from the community. I didn't have to think about these issues, even though I had lived them at many points throughout my life. And one of the things, so in addition to, I was doing my civil rights work, and I thought that that was enough, until August of 2014, when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, for many of us, that was a very eye-opening situation, tragic situation that happened. And I, like probably many of the people in this room, watched the unfolding events from television and thought to myself, this isn't my battle. Like, that's happening over there, that looks scary. Those are some of the things that I was thinking. And then I was writing scholarly articles about the issue, but I didn't think that it was my fight. And then I remember one night in November of 2014, the week of Thanksgiving, that I was watching some things unfold there. This was the night that the government had made the decision that they were going to announce whether the grand jury would indict the officer who killed Mike Brown. And they did this under the cover of darkness, knowing there was so much tension, knowing they had the National Guard there, law enforcement, all the bells and whistles. And I started thinking about the danger that the people were in. Now, one of the things that deeply impacted me was that night seeing on social media that one of the safe houses for the activists was raided by the police. And they threw tear gas in that safe house. And what I saw were children crying. And as a mother, it just touched me so deeply to see these babies caught up in the midst of what looked like war, and they're completely innocent, just there with their parents who have been out on the front lines. And when I saw these children weeping, I started to weep. And I turned to my children and I said, I really feel like I need to go to Ferguson. And I asked my kids to pray. And my son, who was about 9 years old at the time, said, Mom, God said this is a part of your journey. And so literally the next day, I jumped on a plane, showed up at an address for the National Lawyers Guild, and signed up as a volunteer. I wound up being a part of a group that was tear gassed that night. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of Ferguson. I wanted to run back to the Ivory Tower. And after being tear gassed, crying, just all of this, and then I look up, I see young people who had also been tear gassed, but they got right back up and started chanting and demonstrating and protesting. And it reminded me of what people went through during the Civil Rights Movement, right? Where not only did you see adults and teenagers standing up for their rights, but you saw children walking out of school being tear gassed, having fire hoses sprayed on them, having police dogs chasing them, and then going to jail for what they believed in. And all of that came back to me of why I became a civil rights lawyer in the first place. And I'm like, if they can do it, then I can do it. So I stayed the rest of that week in Ferguson. And literally, when I got back to Minnesota later that week, young people approached me saying, we're going to launch Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, will you help us? I didn't know how I could help. I showed up the first meeting wearing a suit. And through a series of events that happened, including being charged in the Mall of America demonstration with 8 misdemeanors, really just for being there and being a spokesperson, one of 11 people that faced a number of charges, being charged as an organizer, even though I didn't feel like one at the time, made me become one. And it changed the trajectory of my life. As a Black woman, recognizing the level of privilege that came with my employment and with my credentials, and realizing that it was much more important. I can use those credentials, but it's more important to stand with the people, right? And so that is the path that my life has taken since having those various experiences. And because I've spent so much time in white spaces, it helps me to be able to communicate with white people about the things that white people are taught on a regular basis that may insulate you from having empathy and compassion and concern for what people of color are experiencing, what our immigrant brothers and sisters are experiencing, what the children locked away in cages and separated from their families are experiencing. So let us take all of these things into account as we think about what it means to be a woman in 2020 in a nation that is extremely diverse across racial and ethnic lines, different languages, different religions, different socioeconomic levels, and how we put aside our own privilege and make a decision that we are going to lift up the experiences of others and show up in genuine solidarity as a true ally. Happy International
Are you guys having fun? It's a Women's International Day, and we should be happy. We should enjoy ourselves. I don't know what I'm doing here, but we'll get it done. There. All right. You know what? It's almost time for all of us to go. But I want to say that, we need to give a pause to our keynote speaker and all our speakers. And also, too, I want to say, we need to give a hand of pause to all of you guys who show up today. I know that this day will not be possible without all of you guys. And I know that for a fact. Today it is International Day, and we're going to mark this day. This day is not the end of the day, because we're going to continue this movement.
That's right.
We're going to mobilize more women. We're going to get up. We're going to wake up in the morning and night, whatever you want to do, because I know that I only slept for 1 hour last night and I'm still here. And you know what? It does not stop you to come here. It does not stop. All we need to do is to be committed. We have to continue the fight. We have to empower each other. We have to keep going.
That's right.
Amen.
And that's what we need to do. There is one thing that I usually want to do. I know that, and I hope you guys are not sick or anything, but can you hug your neighbor and tell her thank you? And look at how nice it is. We have to know each other. This is what it's all about. We have to enjoy each other. Well, you know what? I'm not going to talk so much about it. All I want to say, thank you for coming. Thank you. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Dane. Thank you to Jody. And thank you to everyone. I appreciate you all for being here today. And all our vendors out there who came, thank you. This means a lot to me, and I just don't even know what to say anymore. All I need to know, all I need to tell you all is continue this, okay? Before I keep going, let's continue this. Thank you. Anyway, I'm sorry. Hold on. It's not 7 o'clock yet. Really? Because I was thinking if somebody had a question to any one of these ladies, they could.
all for speaking. Hi, my name is Misha. I just have a question for you. So you were talking a lot about entering, different spaces and welcoming, others to come in. It's hard. It's hard. It's so hard. Sometimes I find like we're at work, and sometimes, women of other nationalities will say things that they mean well, we know they do, but it's don't touch my hair, don't, pet me, because it's deeply rooted in why we don't accept that. So what are some of the things that you use, or, just advice that you can give for some of us to, kind of stand our ground, because I find that often we just kind of just take it and let them touch our hair or ask us about these things, what we eat and stuff like that, when we're all just, human. So what are some of the things that you do just to make it known, like, hey, I don't like it, but this is how we move forward, just being all inclusive.
So that's a great question. So that's a great question. I think that part of it for us as women of color, indigenous women, first of all, it's often shocking when we go into predominantly white environments and we realize that the environments are not prepared for us. That is a culture shock for us. It is not normal for us, especially if we live in cultural enclaves where most people look like you and practice the same things that you practice, eat the same foods. So it is shocking. And I think that one of the things that's important is us preparing our minds for the fact that we are going into environments that aren't ready for us. Which means that when people violate your space by touching your hair, by saying things that are offensive, it's making the decision to educate if you choose to educate. And I tell white women we're not under any obligation to give additional labor by educating people. But if it's about trying to maintain a relationship or start one, then it's figuring out, how do you want to strike a balance in that situation. And so what I would normally do is just take time to educate people and let them know. And then if they violate the space again, or what I said went out the window, at that point, I have to keep my distance, right? Or say, you really need to go and educate yourself about this because it's going to impact your ability to form relationships with other women of color. And then I think, depending on, just kind of how deep you get into it, the other thing to do is to figure out how to help some of the women who are genuine, because I don't give everyone the benefit of the doubt that they're well-intentioned. Some people simply are not. That's just the bottom line. But for those who really are, how do you actually help them become genuine allies? Sometimes that's giving them books to read, videos to watch, encouraging them to show up in spaces and just sit in the back and not center themselves as white people and not take up too much space. It's like completely deprogramming people and re-educating them in terms of how to function in a multiracial society. So I usually just speak the truth and tell it like it is and give people that one opportunity, and then after that, they might see more of the South Central come out. They populate the space again.
Anybody else? I have 1 minute.
I would like for us to hear from at least one or two of the white women who are in this space today, based on what you learned.
Okay, Jonna. She's not that white. She grew up around me. So,
First of all, I'm Jonna. People call me Z because, like some of you beautiful people's names, they get butchered. I am mistaken very easily for Mexican and Latino, so I understand a little bit what the ethnicity groups here experience.
Can you hold the mic closer?
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
I sound like the Verizon guy. Can you hear me now? Yes. Hear me now? Yes. What I was saying is that I relate a little bit to the racism of the ethnic groups that experienced it. They talked about it. But I want people to know of the minority group, we white women do experience racism as well. So it's not just one ethnic group experiences. I didn't grow up with a silver spoon in my mouth. I grew up very poor. I was orphaned till I was 12 years old. then I was blessed to have an American family adopt me. So I was very fortunate. Now I'm speaking because the wonderful speaker, I believe you, loved your speech. Actually, I like all of you guys' and touched my heart. You mentioned Amy Klobuchar. What most of you don't know is that I served in the military, so I'm a veteran. So if you want to know what women experience, I can tell you firsthand. So in the military, I was military police. So I took the oath to protect our country domestically, internationally. But I also took the oath to serve the community I was assigned to. What most people don't know is that it doesn't matter the woman's race, age, or job title in the military. They experience discrimination beyond imaginable. So if you ever heard this phrase, is who you know, not what you know, if you've heard that, that's true. So, when I was in the military as a cop, I did my job fairly and equally. I treated everybody equally regardless of their crime until, as everybody said, innocent until proven guilty. Right? That's not how it works. If I don't like you, which most of my colleagues, I actually feared the white men I worked with than any minority or any person civilian I experienced. So, they had the race card. Of course, it's actually every woman's fair game there's no. So whether you're married, engaged, or single, they don't care. You're fair game. The Army, not just the Army, all branches in the military, if you ever hear these things that are high, it is true. Rape is high. Drug use is high. Violence against women is high. Violence against children is high. It is actually very high, and the reason being it's mental health. Because if someone was deployed, we don't get the treatment inequality. You mentioned Amy Klobuchar. I was actually in a psych hospital when I reached out to her. And like you mentioned about the young man's case, she put a blind eye. It wasn't about because she's a white privileged person. It wasn't had to do with her race. It's her ignorance. I would never vote or give someone like her my vote. Till this day, I would not. I asked myself when I saw the commercial, and when she said, I support veterans, where were you when I was a soldier? Before I became a veteran, where were you when I wrote you a penned out letter telling you that my commander's harassing me because I don't fit his female form? One, I don't spread my legs for any man that I don't want. I shouldn't have to ask you to help me to do your job. You are a commander. I shouldn't have to sleep with you. I'm not a bitch or a whore, excuse my language. These are the labels we women get. That's unfortunate. It doesn't matter if I'm your color or your beautiful color. God bless me, this color. I can't get there. I burn. I look like you're not the dress red. Anyways, we get discriminated. It's really, really bad. So I asked Amy Klobuchar twice, and both times my letters went unanswered. So I was left alone. I nearly was successful in ending my life. I think it's by grace of God I'm here. I usually don't share the story. This is actually my first time telling the story without crying. Until now. If you ever hear the number 22, that is a number that goes to veterans. 22 veterans die a day. It's very sad that happens to us. It happens to, when it comes to women, if you ever heard of, oh, she asked for it. It's her fault. She's ugly. She's fat. There was a young woman that came in against Usher. You don't even know who he is, right? The singer? Yeah. He called her fat, right? Ugly. I don't do women like that. No, but when she was pretty, he raped her. But when something happened to her, no. That's the exact same thing the women in the military experience. She's ugly. She asked for it. She's stupid. Since when these people fail to realize you came from a woman? At any given time, that woman could have aborted you, and she did not. So why are you just mistreating us like we're crap? That was the main argument I talked to my colleagues. Most of you have daughters. How would you react if a man mistreated your daughter? Oh, I would kill him. Okay, then that woman is someone's daughter. That woman is someone's mother. That woman is someone's sister. I consider Namal a sister. We had a lot of classes together. English Composition 1, ESL. I helped her out. She helped me out. I helped her with school. She helped me with cooking. That went disastrous. She helped me with dancing, and this white girl is like a stick. But I could do the Michael Jackson moonwalk, Watch out. But the point I'm trying to tell you guys is that the speeches you guys hear from today, take a little bit with you. Know that you all are beautiful and inside. The outside is only temporary, as I say, because every year we age in age and age. But how you take care of your inside is very, very important. A lady young here spoke today. I couldn't believe when she said she was 300 pounds. I still don't believe her, but I shouldn't doubt her. Let her be an example to what good health is. Let these women, including my sister Namal, be an inspiration to you guys of how you can overcome any adversity faced upon you. We are women, that's correct. We are very integral to this world. Men fear us because of one thing. We have a strong voice. If you ever seen the movie with Denzel Washington, The Great Debater, he mentioned something with one of his students. His name is Henry Lowe, Lowe with an E. And he said this: they can take this, but they cannot take this. When they can't take this, they're weak. So don't let them take your mind. They can abuse the body physically, they can hurt the heart, but when they can't take your mind, they can't take anything away from you. They can't take your name, identity, and who you are as a person. So you guys are strength. Thanks for listening to me. I really appreciate being here. Y'all are so lovely. See? Isn't she wonderful?
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Do you guys want to take a picture? Just one. You don't like together? Yeah. Can we all like take a picture right there and then? Did our photographer go on?
How long is your arm?
Yes, my arm is very long. Shall we all take a picture? Yeah. Can we take it right there?
Everybody ready? We're doing this first? Alright. On the count of three. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Get in here, Jody.
4, 5, 6. There we go, perfect. Excellent. If you want these pictures, then you'll have them. Right. Amy's camera.
Maybe you'll have one.
Excuse me, everybody. I did talk to the reporter before she left, and she did tell me that to your friends, family, allies, or haters that didn't come tonight, they can check out the movement tonight at 9 o'clock on KVRR. Thank you.